Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. My name is Noah Rauch. I'm the Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs here. I want to welcome you all. I want to thank all of our museum members for joining us this evening. I see lots of familiar faces, lots of new faces, so thank you all for coming as well. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on our live web broadcast. So downstairs, inside the museum's historical exhibition underneath the North Tower volume, you can see displayed a wall of newspapers from around the world from September 12th. And the front pages of these papers, they tell one story in big typeface: America Under Attack, Nightmare, Who Did This, A New Day of Infamy, What Now, War on America. These were some of the headlines from Toronto, Akron, Albuquerque, Abilene, London, Boston. Newspapers reporting on a massive historical event that had happened somewhere else. And tonight's program will reflect on how three newspapers, New York City newspapers, reported on a massive historical event happening in their city, happening around them, happening to them. And to help tell this story, we are joined by three journalists and New Yorkers. Jim Pensiero worked at the Wall Street Journal for over 30 years, eventually becoming deputy managing editor. On 9/11, witnessing the attacks, he evacuated the Wall Street Journal from its offices in the World Financial Center just across the street. After retiring from the Journal, he became a professor at Rutgers University. Heidi Evans worked at the Daily News for over 20 years as a health and hospitals reporter. On 9/11, Heidi wrote and contributed reporting to several articles in the Daily News's coverage of the attacks. And in 2006, she received a Pulitzer Prize for her and her colleagues' coverage of 9/11 related health effects. Paul Moses is a retired journalist and journalism professor. He worked at Newsday for over 30 years, where he eventually became city editor of the New York City edition. On 9/11, Paul wrote the cover story for Newsday. He is now professor emeritus of journalism at Brooklyn College and is the author of several books. We are incredibly fortunate to have these panelists with us today. I'd like to thank them for their generosity, for sharing their time and their stories with us. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Jim, Heidi, and Paul in conversation with Museum Director Clifford Chanin.
Thank you, Noah. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the young people in particular. Thank you for coming. One of the things that we do here at the museum, now that some time has passed, and we look back at certain things about 9/11, certain aspects of the day's events and the things that followed. And with the benefit of time, you actually can take a step back from just assuming that everything that happened would have happened anyway, and looking in some detail at how did these things happen? And if you think about what it would be like to cover an event like this, with all the confusion and all the tragedy and the overwhelming aspects of it, and then to think about the newspapers that go out the next day with exhaustive coverage of what had just happened, it raises, at least for us, the question, well, how did they manage to do that? And so we're going to explore that this evening with three journalists from the three newspapers you heard about. And I guess I'd like to sort of start by just each situating yourselves in the moment that it happened. So you learn about this and you are doing whatever you're doing, but all of a sudden you get the call. So we'll start at the end with Paul.
Okay. So I was at the very end of my daily newspaper career because I had taken a job teaching journalism at Brooklyn College. And I let the jobs overlap a little bit. So there were I had 2-3 more days to work at Newsday. And that night I was supposed to come in and write the main story of the primary for mayor. It was a pretty good election going on that year. And so I was actually in the classroom with students when the towers were attacked. And I called in, and they said, come on in, we want you to write the main story. And this was something I had often done at Newsday, will be that person who comes in to do a job they call rewrite. So you have all the feeds from reporters who are calling things into you, and it was my job to fashion that into the story that would be on the cover of the paper. So maybe I'll stop there and
we'll pick it up. Heidi?
I was also in a school that day. I was taking my then second grade daughter, who was 7, who's sitting here tonight, to school along with a coworker, David Saltonstall, his son, who was starting kindergarten for the first day. And we were uptown on 82nd Street and 2nd Avenue. And as I was waiting for David to come down so we could also get to the paper, we were all covering the mayor's, the Democrat primary that day. The lunchroom ladies in the cafeteria at PS 290 were just seemed frantic, and I overheard one say, "Stop saying the word terrorism. There are young children here." And I thought, what? And I went into my car, which was parked right there, and I turned on 1010 Winds News and began to hear about, the planes and that there were more in the air, and we didn't know what was going to happen. So that was where I first heard. And we darted back across Central Park. Actually, Dave and I tried to vote, believe it or not, in the primary, trying to be good citizens. And I also think, the adrenaline was just so intense. And we were told, the mayor's primary has been called off. And the next thing we do, we just drove down the West Side Highway, got to the Daily News on 33rd Street, and began the day.
Jim, you at the Wall Street Journal's office are across the street from the World Trade Center at 200 Liberty, so just across the West Side Highway. And so you are trying to pull coverage together, but you're also in the combat zone.
Yeah, I was there. At the time, I was assistant managing editor for kind of the consigliere for the managing editor. I did budgets, I did personnel, I ran newsroom technology. I was sort of worked with all the other departments, and I was in. I would go in early. I was a day-sider at that point, but the managing editor, Paul Steiger, was there because we were going to work on the budget. It was a job he hated to do, but it was like eat your spinach. You have to. And I wasn't aware of anything going on. I had a little office, and it faced south towards New York Harbor. And one of the foreign editors said, "You got to come see this." And the page one on the 9th floor faced West Street. And so that was sort of catty corner to the South Tower. And I ran over there, and we were on the 9th floor, and you had to crane your neck at the North Tower. And it was like 4 floors were smoke and fire. There were cars burning on the street. And it was like a ticker tape parade. And I just remember looking at it, and Steiger was there. We looked at it and go, what the hell just happened here? And I wasn't aware of any airplanes. I hadn't heard anything. And I had worked several years before when the tower had been bombed down in the parking garage.
1993, yeah.
And that, I was working that day, and I said, how did somebody get bombs up on like the top floors of the World Trade Center, North Tower? And the only thing I could liken it to would be, have any of you ever been to a football game or a baseball game or in person? And so you're me to you. And you don't see what's going on the periphery. You don't really know. You can see the game better watching it on television. But when you're really close, you don't know what's going on. And we didn't know what was going on. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Sure. We'll come to the second plane, because the first plane, and I was listening to the radio that morning, nobody could quite figure out what was going on, who was hearing it secondhand. There were people who did see the plane go into the building and thought this was deliberate. But, if you're doing this secondhand, it just becomes part of the background of what you're doing until the second plane hits. And all of a sudden, the event is transformed. And I'm curious because here we are in the city of New York, and you have a normal day with the first day of school and the primary election. And all of a sudden, it's turned into a combat zone. And Paul, I don't know what time you get to the Newsday office, but, all of a sudden the dynamic of everything has changed, and I assume it's an all hands on deck situation.
Oh yeah, everybody on the staff, at that point the bulk of the staff was based on Long Island, although we had a edition in the city at that time. And so, yeah, everybody was on the story. And when you're on rewrite, you're kind of, in some ways, sort of like telling the reporters, no, I need this, go out and get this. But the circumstance was very difficult because communication was so hard, right? We had cell phones in 2001. We had the internet, but it was not a big priority, I would say. It wasn't like now where you'd be following this story totally on the internet and on your phone, and none of that. What ran on the September 12th still was kind of what mattered in the newsroom. But yeah, everything was sort of chaotic, but they had reporters just about everywhere covering every kind of angle you can think of. And you got to take off your hat to the reporters who were on the scene. To me, it was always amazing that none of them died that day because they were in the middle of a lot of dangerous situations. But as I recall, as you kind of into this sort of cloud of chaos that you're trying to find the order to it to make a news story that you can summarize in one big long sentence at the top, and then and just structure it. And it was very hard to get my mind around how to do that. So that was kind of the late morning, early afternoon, and just to draw the context of biggest terrorist attacks and kind of the history from the 1993 bombing, just to kind of get the context and try to make sure the reporters were all in the places that I needed to get what I thought we needed.
Yeah. Heidi, it's a very different mentality all of a sudden, and the challenge of being out there, and there's personal risk in certain circumstances, but also you're now dealing with traumatized people, whether you're on the scene or not.
Yeah, and I was telling Cliff earlier, you're juggling 3 identities at once. Mainly, as a journalist, because this extraordinary event has happened, you have to suit up, and bring your A game and go to work. At the same time, it had so turned everybody's days upside down, right? So here you have a young child in 2nd grade, and I'm thinking, my husband at the time was the LA Times bureau chief, and he only had 2 reporters there, so he had to put together, as Paul did, this big story for the main story with just feeds from those 2 reporters and then people watching television in Washington and 3,000 miles away. I knew he, as the lone writer on that story, was probably going to be working till midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. Can't leave a 2nd grader at that school overnight. And our babysitter wasn't able to get to work because she lived in Brooklyn and the subways were closed. So I'm juggling in my mind sort of 3 identities, right? I'm a journalist, I'm a parent, and I'm a New Yorker. And for those few quiet moments that you have to yourself on a day that you think, wow, this is my city, this is my home. It was a lot, but the work keeps you focused, as you said, Jim, right? The work keeps you very focused. So I got my assignment, and I asked for an assignment to be out on the street. I did not want to be in the newsroom because I thought I had to go get this child at some point and get her home safely. So I said, send me anywhere, whatever. Anyway, so they sent me to interview people, New Yorkers, tourists, whoever, at New York City's landmarks. And I went to the Plaza Hotel, which had suddenly become a place, a fortress. They had managers outside with a manifest. Unless you were a guest or a staff person and could show a key, nobody was allowed in there. And I went to Carnegie Hall and other New York landmarks, always also in the back of my mind looking at my watch, when do I have to get her? And a very memorable moment, just how good humans can be, and just Americans, and just sort of we're all in this together. I interviewed a couple from Houston, Texas, and I always thought New Yorkers were the most colorful people until you interview people from Texas. And this woman said to me, she said, what a terrible thing. Obviously, she said, we've come here. She said, we've got tickets for 5 nights on Broadway, center orchestra seats. I guess we're not going to be able to see any of those shows. They're going to close down. And then she said, just a little jittery from all this. She said, but it's such a marvelous city. People are so nice. And even the pharmacist had Prozac for me. And, and I said, yes, we do have that here. New Yorkers do have that. And she was such a colorful interview. Now, there are not enough photographers on an event like this, right, to go out with every single reporter. And most of our photographers were downtown taking pictures of the atrocity. And she had a camera in her hand that didn't look that expensive, but I had to make the ask anyway. I said, I need to take your picture to go with my story, and I need your camera for the rest of the day. And I said, I promise you, I will send you back your camera, and I will buy new film. I think there was still film in those days.
Sure.
Yes, there was. And she gave me her camera, and I took all the pictures that I needed for that day. And then I raced over to Alex's school on 82nd Street, got her and little Gus out, drove across Central Park, took an elderly lady who was stuck. You couldn't get through there. And I said, get in the car too. I would otherwise never pick up a hitchhiker. On that day I did. And got her and Gus situated back home with Gus's mom. She had another little one at home. And you know, God bless Elise. She made a lovely day for those kids. They would never know that there was, you know, this thing that would change the city's life, the world's life, and maybe their lives, you know, for years to come. And so I then raced back to the office, dumped my notes about the tourists, then was assigned another story about how do you tell children about what has happened and calling experts and watching the entire newsroom just sort of go into full steam ahead and produce this 80-page paper in just a few hours. So that was kind of my day.
Jim, you got a very particular assignment because not only did the paper have to be put out, but you couldn't stay in your office to do it.
Well, yeah, back to the 9th floor, east-facing windows with our necks craned. Paul Steiger looked at me and said, and very cool about it. You know, he was a very cool man. He said, they're going to evacuate us. And no, but it wasn't clear what was going on. And so there was nothing wrong with our building. And nobody at that moment, this was, you know, maybe 10 minutes after the first plane hit, nobody foresaw that the tower was going to fall down. I mean, when you think about high-rise fires, they tend to burn to the top and like chimneys. But, you know, again, we didn't even know at that moment that. So he looks at me, and I'm kind of his head of operations, and I had led a team to put in a new technology, desktop publishing system that you could even use remotely. You know, it was very good stuff. And he said to me, if they evacuate us, can we make a paper? And I said, yeah, I think we can, but it would have to be in South Brunswick, New Jersey, which is 50 miles away. And we'd have to get a certain number of the right people, and the networks that we use, the technology that connects the various bureaus, that would have to continue to work. But if those things were maintained, we could do it. And I was a little faster than that, but that's. And so he looks at me and says, well, get on it. So I leave, I take one last look at this horror show. I go back to my little office and I start to write a memo, which I think this museum has a copy of. I know the museum had it, which was write a memo to the staff that we're going to be evacuated. This is what we know, which is like next to nothing, but it's really bad. A Washington bureau is to take over the coverage until the New York operation can get reorganized. And right around when I was kind of working on this memo, the second one hit.
Second plane.
And that was the South Tower. It was lower and he was faster. And like that one shook our building. The windows bowed. I think to myself, pardon my French, holy shit, what was that? I run back over to page 1, and it was like, anybody here ever had their eyes dilated? You know, it was like my colleagues there, it looks like their eyes were dilated because you didn't see the plane. The plane was going 500 miles an hour. Your eyes couldn't, you're too close and it's too fast. So they didn't see the airplane, but they saw this giant fireball, which is certainly in some of these pictures in the,
This one here.
in the newspaper, when the South Tower. And at that point, we knew we were witnessing a nightmare, and we didn't know who, what, when, how, basic journalistic stuff, but we figured we were going to have to run for our lives. And Steiger said to me, finish up what you got to do. I'll meet you downstairs. Downstairs being Liberty Street. Liberty Street connects to West Street. The South Tower is on West Street and Liberty Street. I go back, I start working on this memo again, which is to go out to all points. And you guys know when certain moments when you're doing a roundup, you got to send it to everybody. And the security guy said, comes in the office, says, "You got to go, buddy." They'd announced we had to evacuate. And I remember asking him, I said, should I take the steps? Because you take the steps when it's a fire drill. He goes, "Nah, take the elevator." Again, nobody really knew how bad it was. But once you got outside, it was chaos. There were sirens everywhere. There were firefighters everywhere. They were putting their gear on and they were tromping down Liberty Street to go into the towers. And they were triaging, the medics were triaging people on Liberty Street. And I couldn't find Steiger. And he had told me, get it organized. I had sent the note when they kicked me out of the office. I did hit the send button, sent it out to all points. The technology really worked. That saved our ass. Because if that didn't work, then we're dead. I can't find Steiger. I'm really getting scared because I don't really know what's going on. I run into a woman that I worked with in the HR department. And I said, "Toby, I hear these were airplanes, but I didn't." "Oh, yeah, they were airplanes, all right." I said, "Well, how can you tell?" "Well, I just stepped over a tire, like a giant airplane tire out on West Street." "Okay, I'm out of here. I can't find Steiger. He's told me what he wants me to do. The only way I can do it is I have to somehow get across the Hudson River. The way I normally commute is the path. That's in the basement of the Trade Center. I can't do that." And I start walking the wrong way. I start walking toward the Battery because I'm a little shocked. I think I'm shocked. And I said, "Come on, you're going the wrong way. My only way is a boat." And it was the New York Waterway. And there was a boat there down by the promenade off the Winter Garden. And I got on the boat, and I didn't have a ticket, but they said, "We don't care, just get on the boat." And there were people walking around on their cell phones trying to reschedule their meetings. Okay? But the cell phones didn't work downtown. The tower had some of the transmitters, so the cell phones really weren't working very well. And I get on the boat. The boat's about 2/3 of the way across the river, and you watch the South Tower go down. And Steiger's not there. I can't see our building. It's covered in like a cloud of dust. I can't see the building. I can't see Steiger. There's nobody I had seen in the office that morning is on this boat with me. And I'm pretty freaked out. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah.
But that's what it was, kind of what it was like.
So, the flow of stuff to you. So you are sort of the funnel that everything has to go through. When did it really start inundating you, and how can you describe what it was? And also, how can you describe how you make order out of this chaos. It's your job under normal circumstances, but this is anything but a normal circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the feeds just were coming in as soon as I got there, and I was taking them over the phone, you know, that whole thing. And then they set up a system where other people would take the feeds and, you know, feed them to me and sometimes digest them in ways that were helpful. So I actually had saved all the feeds there.
Wow.
This is all from notes from the staff, and there's a wire copy, AP copy and stuff is mixed in there too. So it was a lot of material to organize, and I really struggled to find the top of the story. And I remember I walked around the newsroom. I may have even gone outside, just trying to find it. And eventually, I realized that this is just like every other story you've written, only the pieces are bigger. And that kind of helped me to get it together. And the other guiding principle is that is human life comes first. So emphasize the deaths before any property. And so that's also a factor in writing the story. And it was an amazing thing to write, because if you're a New York City reporter, as we were for many years, you know, even the death of one firefighter, for example, is front page news. If it's a tabloid paper, probably the lead story even. And here you had, we didn't know how many, but seemingly hundreds. And it was maybe the fourth, I forget now, maybe the fourth paragraph of the story.
Yeah. So I'll read the lead, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
In an unprecedented attack, by the way, this is a newspaper. In an unprecedented attack that told Americans they're no longer safe, 2 hijacked jets on a horrifying suicide mission slammed into the World Trade Center yesterday, killing thousands in the nation's worst terrorist assault, and another crashed into the Pentagon. So there you have it. The numbers are not clear yet. And
no.
How much did you have to struggle to define the scale of this?
There were no numbers that day, and you want to focus on the number of deaths, and there's no authoritative figure anywhere. And in fact, the normal places where we would call to get that information weren't being staffed that day in the police department and in the fire department. I guess everybody was out in the field. But late in the day, President Bush said that thousands of people died, and that's the backup for that figure there, and it did turn out to be in the multiple thousands.
Yes.
Although maybe not quite as high as it might have seemed at first when people said there were 50,000 people. I was actually looking through the different drafts of the story, and one of the copy editors caught that he didn't want to imply that there could be a number approaching 50,000. Yeah. And he took out the sentence that said 50,000 people were believed to be working there, which turned out to be, because of the attack was early in the day, there probably weren't as many people in the Trade Center as there might have been later in the day.
Yeah.
So gradually the story comes together that way. And then we use this structure. If you're studying journalism, as some of you are, you've probably learned about the inverted pyramid, right? The most important thing comes at the top, and then down, down, down. And then there's another format that I like to use. I think it's called the hourglass. You know, the hourglass. So once you've kind of given all the main news, then you start the story again from the beginning, only chronologically. And that's a good way to get some of the color and drama into the story, and try to infuse some of the emotion into it without making it melodramatic. I think is a big part of the challenge to writing the story like that. But it took me a while just to find the basic building blocks for the story. And the other thing that always amazed me too is late in the afternoon, it may have been around 5 o'clock, and I was kind of finishing up the story then. I'd gotten stuff from we had one reporter who had pretty good intelligence sources in Washington, and that was in there. And anyway, it was all coming together. And then 7 World Trade Center collapses, 47-story building right nearby where we are here. And can you imagine? And where does that go in the story? way down. It didn't involve deaths, fortunately.
That's right.
It was where the city's emergency command center was, but they had evacuated it not long before the building collapsed. But I mean, that's a whole huge story in itself, and you have to read a long way before you get to that in that piece. So that's kind of the overview of how the story's put together.
Yeah. Heidi, Paul refers to melodrama as something you want to avoid, but how do you avoid it under these circumstances? The emotions are so raw, the sort of the human drama, to coin a phrase, is so visceral, it is the only thing you see, and yet capturing that in a way that feels true as opposed to exaggerated must be part of a challenge to you.
Well, I mean, having a seasoned editor-in-chief was very important, I think. And just as you say, for Steiger, there is almost like a calm that has to come over you. I wouldn't say a numbness, but a calm. You can't write if you can't think. You can't do anything if you can't think. And particularly for the person who is going to create this paper and make all the assignments and layout and wait for pictures and headlines. I called, Ed Kozner was the editor during this time, and I actually called him or emailed him a week or two ago to ask him for his memories of that day. And he said he started his day shaving, listening to 1010 Winds, and then turned on the TV, saw this, and he said he knew it would be the hardest day of his life in a 40-year career in journalism. And I just remember seeing him as just a picture of calm that day. And he knew exactly what he wanted the front page headline to be. He was a person of history. He knew that this was going to be the beginning of wars, for decades to come. And he was just waiting for the right photo to come, because he said what was unique about the story was an airplane coming into a building. So I hadn't thought of that. Your thought makes total sense. How could somebody get a bomb on the 90th story? Who would have ever imagined, right, that it was an airplane? And so, here you just see an entire newsroom. And if any of you have worked in well, I don't know if people work in newsrooms anymore. Everybody works remote. But, there were editors who hadn't written a story in years, but they were beautiful writers in their day. They all stepped up to the plate to write. You had people who used to write once a week, these lovely stories on Sunday. It was like, no, you've got 3 stories you got to do today. And everybody did their part. And you see the bylines on some of these stories, and it's just amazing. The adrenaline, I think, is what gets you there. And then having a calm person who was directing traffic, and there's just, it just all comes together that way. I was fortunate, I suppose, there were people doing all that organizing, and how I spent the next days, weeks, months, years, really. The story did not go away, so there was plenty of time to write about how World Trade Center, number 7 collapsed.
Yes.
We're telling the human stories of how people coped. Dads, most of the people who died at the World Trade Center were men, and many of them, but there were a number, obviously a good number, who were women. And how did those husbands and fathers, in particular, of young children cope day-to-day life when the main, anchor of their family, the wife and mom, had disappeared? And I spent time with 3 different dads living that experience in 3 different parts of New York. And I was just rereading one of those stories. I mean, it's as compelling today as it was 23 years ago. Yeah. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just what you asked about the melodrama and avoiding it. Basically, you want to if you have good reporting and good details, you avoid that kind of contrived, melodrama. I did use the word horrifying in the lead. I'd probably never use it in any other story, but this did call for a kind of a bigger statement. But there's details all throughout the story that I think, give the emotion without telling people you should be crying at this or you should be emotional about this. I think the key to that kind of writing is in the detail that you used. And I think there were a couple of songs that I used in the story. I think I had a line in there about the death of so many firefighters left a hole in the heart of the city. And I was thinking of that Paul Simon song, Losing Love is like a window in your heart. Everybody sees you blown apart. You can see the wind blow. And then there's another one where I noticed in the pictures, or maybe one of the reporters told me this, that everybody was caked with white dust, but people, you could see the tracks of their tears. So there's that old rock song, The Tracks of My Tears. So just little things like that, that help to visualize.
Jim, how does the Wall Street Journal get produced that day?
Well, again, we had, my background was, half of my career was as a line editor, a copy editor, assistant news editor, night news editor, copy chief, deputy national editor. And the second half was kind of working behind the scenes to keep the trains on the tracks. So, but I didn't know how to make a paper. I mean, I had done that for a long time. And our only hope was this South Brunswick backup news operation. And one of the really sweet things about the Journal is, at a risk of sounding trite, the place was quite patriotic. I mean, everybody who worked there, from the truck drivers to the pressmen to the HR, everybody knew what we were up against, especially the IT people. Because again, we printed, at that time, we printed 2.1 million copies a day nationwide. We had 17 printing plants. Everything was satellited around. It was a very complex news operation and a production operation, an advertising operation. It was it's a big place. So I'm walking the streets of Jersey City at this point. Like, how do I get to my car in Harrison? Okay? And the path was still running. And I found out later that I was on the last ferry boat and I was on the last westbound to Newark path train, got off in Harrison, drove down to South Brunswick. As you're driving, I'm listening. I wasn't listening to the winds. I was listening to WCBS. And I'm finding out about the Pentagon. I'm finding out about a lot of information is already evolving. This is about 10:30, about 11 in the morning. So about 11 in the morning, I'm driving down the Garden State Parkway, and I'm going to South Brunswick. And I know the IT people are aware because we sent them the same memo. I know they're taking these 3 training rooms. They're like little classrooms, and they're stripping off the Excel, the various kind of non-news software, and they're putting our production software on it. They're literally running cables down to hook into the satellite uplink. We had practiced this as a drill, but this wasn't a drill. So I get to South Brunswick, it's about noon. And what was weird, you're driving down the New Jersey Turnpike, and every little town in New Jersey is sending their rescue squads up the turnpike to help in New York. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm driving, like, I really appreciate you people doing this, but if they didn't get out of those buildings, they're dead. There's nobody to save if they didn't get out. Because when you saw that tower go down, you said, they're not going to make it. It turned this giant building into dust. So how do we do it? I show up in South Brunswick. There's no other news people there. And I remember going in, and the vice president of production, this little tough Irishman named Sheehan, goes, "Where are your people?" I said, "I don't know, Mike. I don't know where they are. I just got here." "Well, they better get here." I go, "Mike, just calm down, calm down." So little by little, people started coming in. Steiger had told Washington, until we can get ourselves organized, Washington, you take over the story. And that was Alan Murray was the bureau chief, great editor. And they took it over. The national editor, Marcus Brauckley, was in his, was on his way to work and he had to turn around and go back to where he lived in Brooklyn. Again, the email was working. Things were working, but we were just scattered to the wind. So it was like, has anybody here ever driven on ice? like stepped on the brakes in ice? And you sort of say, okay, I just turned the wheel this way, but I ain't going there. So it was like driving on ice. And you just sort of say, okay, what do we know? We know there's a catastrophe. We know Washington is managing the story. We also know that the Wall Street Journal, which has about at the time, like 35, 40 news bureaus around the world, they're all aware of what's going on. And each one of them, and this is what I loved about the place, they were self-directed. They would say, if I'm covering the airline industry, what's my part of the story? If I'm covering national security, what's my part of the story? If I'm covering, fill in any of the beats, if I'm covering the markets, what's going to happen to the core things that we cover? And so, I mean, this is our paper. It looks very 1890s, but, what's going to happen to airport security? So the reporters and editors out in the field were doing their job. They were coming up with budget lines of stories they wanted to write. They were proposing lengths for these stories. And so when I was in South Brunswick, I said to Washington, and I don't know where Steiger was. He wasn't around.
Did he die?
I thought it was very possible he died. Because it was just nothing but a cloud of dust. And I knew he was there, and I didn't know how. And he was one of those people that was covered in talc, covered in asbestos dust. But once it happened, this island truly was an island. All the tunnels were closed, all the bridges were closed. If you didn't get off the island, you weren't getting off. They were taking authorities were taking people to Staten Island if they needed to go west. But so I'm in South Brunswick, and then little by little, people start coming in. I talk to Washington. I'm the most senior New York editor who's made it. There's like 4 deputy managing editors, but they're all stuck in New York. Steiger turns up. He's okay. He's home. He's changed clothes, took a shower. But then it says, okay, well, what are we going to do? So the first thing I had to do was talk to this guy in production. What kind of paper can we make? Normally at that time we were making a 3-section paper. And our emergency plans were to make a 1-section paper. Sheehan said, it's easier to print a 2-section paper. I said, fine, it's a 2-section paper. So we couldn't have a long debate about anything. And what happened to me that day was there was nobody else to make these decisions, so I just started making them. And then when I talked to Steiger, he said, and I told him what I had done, 2-section paper, this many pages, we got editors trickling in, and he just says, just do what you have to do. And I give the man a lot of credit, because the people he hired over the years, if you worked for Paul Steiger and he put you in a certain job, he put you in there because he believed you could do it, and you didn't need to be micromanaged. You need to be macro-managed, like what is it that we want to do as an organization. But so he just said, you know how to do this, just do it. So at that point, we put a budget together. People kept trickling in, and like Heidi said, people who didn't do the job that they normally did, as they came in, I kind of knew their skill sets, and I'd say, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. And I only had one person push back on me, and because he wanted to write the column he always wrote. And I said, we're not having that column today. I need you to write worldwide, okay, which is a front page column. And he says, I've never written worldwide. I said, but you write a column of small items. These are going to be small items. These are going to be small items about this catastrophe. And he goes, I don't know, I can't do that. I said, I'm going to put a text sitting right next to you to deal with formats. And he said, well, I don't know. It was the only time I actually lost my cool that day. I yelled at him, and I cursed at him, and I said, if you're not going to do this, then get your rhymes with bass out of this room, because we don't have time for this. And it was in a room. We had a bunch of editors in there at that point, and it was just like dead silence because nobody had ever heard me yell. And I was ashamed. Later I apologized to him, but he did it, and he did a great job. And every year on 9/11, he'd come see me and say, Jim, how did I do that day? But we gradually, again, the driving on ice metaphor, by about 4 in the afternoon, we had decided what the book was going to look like. We had a budget of stories. People were filing. We had just enough editors and the right skill sets of editors to do what we needed. We didn't have enough graphics people, so our graphics were really limited. But just the self-direction of the staff to do their job without being told what to do.
Right.
And that's one thing I liked about the Journal, because the Journal worked 3 different ways. There was some top-down stuff. There was a lot of bottom-up stuff, which is the reporters are out there covering their beats. They tell you what's going on. You don't have to tell them what to do. And then there's sort of a lateral. So on that day, it was mostly bottom-up and lateral. The top was, we just had to kind of swim the best we could.
So I want to get to a concluding question for all of you, but Heidi, I do not want to miss the fact that your reporting and then your work with the editorial team at the News was really, I think, the first really focused journalistic attention on the health effects issues after 9/11, and this is what won you and your colleagues a Pulitzer Prize. We don't have time for the whole story, but I want to know, what was it that propelled this interest on the part of the paper as an editorial matter first, as opposed to in the news hole of this?
Yeah.
It was on the editorial side of the paper. What was it, and what drove that as powerfully as it did?
Arthur Brown was the editorial page editor at the time, and he had probably every job at the paper coming up since being a copy boy.
This is 2006, 2007, I just
Right. And so he really knew the paper inside out. He'd been, a city editor, he'd been investigative reporter, he'd been managing editor, and then found himself as the editorial page editor. Very creative mind, and what prompted him to have this idea to take a look. It was now 5 years later. There was a detective, NYPD detective James Zadroga, who died of lung disease. He had been working at the pile, hundreds of hours. He was from New Jersey. I think it was Ocean County Medical Examiner Office ruled his cause of death toxic air that he breathed and all of those substances, and this rare lung disease that police officers didn't get. Firefighters might get this, and Arthur thought, we need to really get to the bottom of, did this cause his death and others we were starting to hear about, or didn't it? Were there health effects from the pulverized concrete glass and all of the substances from those 2 towers, and for the responders and others that were there? And so he just started to look at, let's see what kind of medical journal articles have been there, and started to because he always believed for the editorial page, you re-report, you add new information. And he sort of ran that department as if they were a separate news operation in addition, not just commenting on, stories of the day. So Bev Weintraub, who was on the editorial board as well, she started to read through these journals. There had been already by then, 5 years later, 27 different studies. The New York City Fire Department had done many of them, environmental health experts, Mount Sinai. And long of the short of it is there was something to go on. And Arthur then decided, we needed a reporter from the news side. And he got the editor then to agree to do these stories on the front pages of the paper. And do original reporting. I then interviewed many of the victims, and we were getting lots of calls from families, firefighters, telephone workers, whoever came down there to respond in those days. And we're starting to have what then became known as the World Trade Center cough, or GERD, acid reflux from breathing and all that. And then this odd constellation of lung diseases and that Mount Sinai was seeing. And so he basically sort of said, okay, we're just going to report this. And as you started to report, call the police department, you asked them, well, first, like, how many people did you have down there? They couldn't tell you that. How many people are saying they're ill? Couldn't tell you that. The fire department, on the other hand, because they give firefighters an annual exam every year, and they have great medical documentation of all of their firefighters each year, they had real evidence that they could track from somebody who'd been working in the department X number of years, and then what did their lungs look like 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later. So basically, we then did a series of 13 editorials, and more and more people were starting to call. We also had a hotline. If you have had an issue, if you've been sick, please call and tell us your stories. And little by little, brick by brick, you see, wow, in a city that was so proud to have one of the great health departments, and a Mayor Bloomberg at the time, who was so public health oriented, nobody, not the mayor, not the governor, not the federal government, nobody ever asked the question, who was sick? What do they need? When Pearl Harbor happened, before we were all born, right?
I hope so.
Yeah. Civilians as well as, first responders went to the call of duty, and money was given to pay for their medical coverage, whatever. But first, the paper needed to define who was ill, how many people, who was there. And 5 years had gone by and nobody had ever looked. So that's how it began, and that's how we began to press and advocate, because with an editorial page, unlike the news page, which would have been this, that, weigh things evenly, you could take a position and you could advocate for change. Yeah. And the editor-in-chief at the time, who was a Brit, he was fine putting these stories on the front page, pictures of people, not just type. And it was very, very compelling journalism, and it did force the federal government and Governor Pataki at the time and Mayor Bloomberg to start this shift, to pay attention to and pay for the medical coverage and for victims' compensation fund. So it played a very key role in justice for the people who responded, the people who lived there, and still a little bit more to go. The Zadroga Act wasn't passed until 2010 to pay for this, and the New York delegations pushed hard, and there's still a little bit more money that needs to be funded for the health care, because people, they saw, as Mount Sinai and others predicted, you're going to see cancers 20 years later. In fact, that's what we see, and interstitial lung disease, all kinds of awful things. And these people deserve to have medical coverage for serving. So that's how it got started.
Thank you. Let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. Gentleman here, wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I just have a quick question for the panelists. Is there any way after this is over, I can meet and take pictures of the newspapers and other documents that you have? Thank you very much.
There you go. Sure. That's an easy question. right behind. Sure. Right behind. Yeah.
I'm sure, on that day and in the days immediately after, politicians, law enforcement, they probably, had a lot that they were focusing on. But did any of you deal with any kind of interference, or anyone coming to you and saying please don't publish XYZ, or we don't want this getting out to the public or anything like that? Or was it just whatever you guys found out you could publish? And
No, not at all. I mean, we were, I think we were viewed certainly by our readers, and I'm sure for Newsday and the Daily News it's the same thing, which was we were doing a public service by trying to present with us. I know for us and all three of these publications, you print what you know, you print facts, you stick out a speculation, and we won a Pulitzer for our September 12th paper, and nobody ever told us, no government official ever told us what we could do or not do. And if they had, we would have told them what they could do in their hat.
It did get sticky, though, a little further on when it was Christy Whitman, who was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, 3 days later.
It's all good.
Said the air is clean, the air is fine, Wall Street can reopen, you can go back to work, Broadway can reopen, whatever. The air was safe to breathe. And Mayor Giuliani also went along with that. Then you started to have journalistic issues because just seeing what you saw with your own eyes, how could this possibly be true? The news at that point went and got whatever the gizmos were at the time to measure
Right, it's a little device.
things in the air, and they hung them all over that area because we wanted to get our own calculations and send them to a laboratory for analysis. And there were 2 reporters that started to follow the trail of that and to push back at politicians who had said the air is safe. Did you feel that as far as Wall Street reopening? What was?
Well, our office was destroyed. So it was, the building is still there, of course. But all the windows were blown out. It was covered in asbestos. We didn't get back into the building for 11 months, 14 days, 2 hours. I mean, it was late August of 2002. One of my colleagues, a number of my colleagues were dusted. Okay, they were totally, one of them was killed by it, Rich Regis.
Oh, I didn't know.
He died
Of exposures.
He died of exposure. He died about 6-7 years after the fact. But there was no going back for a long time because our office, it wasn't, we housed the reporters up on Canal Street. We had a little office in Canal Street. All the editing operations stayed in New Jersey for a long time, years.
I just want to add one thing to your point. Mayor Bloomberg and others, there were many who didn't want to believe that people were getting sick because of this, because as the mayor of the city, he did not want to pay for the liability, right, of whatever liability was there. This would be something the federal government. So he, for a very long time, never even uttered the words respiratory distress syndrome or interstitial lung disease. And I know for a fact within one major newspaper, there were editors there who didn't believe it either 5 years later, any years later. So there was a lot of journalism to be done by everybody in the aftermath. But on the day of, no, nobody was telling us what.
I'm going to ask one final question before we go for each of you. Given what's happened in the news business in the intervening years, I mean, these were all robust newspapers in 2001. That is not the case in the industry now. If an event of this magnitude were to happen again, would the coverage be up to the task, do you think?
I think the basic building block, there was one year we won a Pulitzer for covering a spot news story. It was a subway accident that killed 5 people. Our paper used to have subway columnists. In other words, we had a lot of institutional knowledge. I think good reporting in an emergency is often built on that kind of knowledge. Like Jim said, people from all over the paper responded out of their expertise. The other thing that's so different is there were rumors being passed around that day to not fall for. But nowadays, the way social media would multiply rumors exponentially would be unbelievable for an event like that. So that it would really be important to have good reporting very quickly. But I think your question about would the coverage be less strong? I think so. I think there's been there's just less institutional knowledge in newsrooms now. Not to say there's not still a lot of really good reporters out there. There are.
Heidi, your thoughts? Would it be up to the task?
Well, papers all over the country, right? Smaller, shrinking staff. It's like TikTok would cover it, I guess. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, you still have major papers doing major work, but all of the regional papers around the country. I mean, the Daily News now is,
Certainly the Daily News and Newsday couldn't do now what they did then.
No.
And the Times hardly covers New York City. That would cost in a story like this.
But the Journal is still thriving.
The Journal is still a thriving enterprise.
Well, the Daily News was a finalist for breaking news. I mean, we won for breaking news, and I think we got a thumb on the scale because we did a really good job, but we also had a kind of a backstory of kind of how hard it was to do it. When I look at the Daily News, or I look at the New York Times or Newsday, which had a full New York edition, I don't think we could quite do. I think the Journal could do a lot of what it did. I'm not sure we could do all of it. But the Journal still has a pretty good economic base because it has a lot of digital customers. But at that time it was an advertising-based model. All of us were advertising, and the advertising's gone. So if you're not making it on subscriptions, you don't have enough revenue to have a big staff. So I think it would be very hard.
Well, we wanted to look behind the curtain in this and figure out how this all happened. I think we got a really good idea. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time. Please join me in thanking Jim Pensiero, Heidi Evans, Paul Moser.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you.